Okay, hi guys, I'm Billy and let's talk books. That is the first time I'm saying this, as this is my very first video on this channel. My name is Billy and I'm currently a postgraduate student studying contemporary literature and culture. I'm going to do one of those kind of like booktube newbie videos, so look out for that. I'm not going to introduce myself too much here because this video is all about my very first time reading a Stephen King novel. So a bit of background information. I have been saying for like so many years that I can't believe I've never read a Stephen King novel. Stephen King is such a giant of fiction, has so many books, so many like legacies, amazing movies. And I don't actually think I've ever watched any of his movies either, actually. Anyway, tangent. I was in the bookshop a couple of weeks ago and I saw the Stephen King section and I was like, okay, it is time. I am finally going to read a Stephen King novel. And then, of course, I was faced with the fact that there were so many Stephen King novels that I just did not know what to choose. I ended up going with it because I actually have a friend that I went to school with who, back in the day, I think this must have been about 10 years ago now, she told me that it is one of her favourite books. And I'd always kind of assumed that it was just, weird, creepy clown, horror. But she explained to me that it's so much more than just the clown, and kind of that's become the pop cultural image, Pennywise the clown. Like, you see pictures of him, and there's that clown in London that like dresses up as Pennywise and chases people. Please never do that to me. But actually the book itself is a lot more rich and full of depth and really focuses on kind of like childhood trauma, and that is what I had remembered from my friend telling me about this novel. And so when I saw it, I was like, do you know what? That's the one. I've heard good things about it, I've been told about it, and I really wanted to see for myself kind of what the fuss was about. So I went for it. That is the backstory. I guess I'll just give you my thoughts on how I felt about it. Spoiler-free thoughts at first, and then I'm going to go into way more detail. I loved it. I completely soaked it up, read it so fast. It's such a big book, but I just was constantly wanting to read it. I found King's prose so incredibly beautiful and clever, and his character work was fascinating. The themes that he used in this novel as well, like some of the ones I picked up on were, innocence, the loss of innocence in childhood. A big one was about belief as well, like whether that be negative or positive belief, whether that be fear-based belief or whether that be hope. Friendship, solidarity, and like community, I found was a really prominent theme as well. I'd also say adversity, overcoming adversity, I really loved. Maybe also like the human psyche and like both the best and worst parts of the human psyche. So yeah, those were some of the themes that I really, really loved. And so my friend, you were absolutely right. It is so much more than a novel about a clown. That's kind of my overview. Really enjoyed it. I will say there are some elements that I just could have absolutely done without. It's not without its flaws. I had a few big problems with this novel, which I will go on to talk about. If you've read it, I'm sure you can kind of know what I'm referring to. But as a first introduction to King, I definitely want to read more of his work. To be honest, I am struggling to pick up a new book that's not King because I just want to read another King. I think what I'm going to do on this channel as well, if you would like to see it, is keep reviewing King novels and, maybe do some different individual videos and eventually come with a tier list of how I felt about each one, which ones are my favourite, because I loved it. I loved his writing. I think me and King are really going to get along. I'm going to now hop into the spoiler section of the review. I have quite a lot to talk about, so we're just going to get started. Hope you don't mind a long video because I definitely can talk. Let's now get into my thoughts in like some more depth. I'm going to go into like various different elements that I want to talk about. From this point on, it's going to be full spoiler warning. I'm going to talk about the book with complete spoilers. The first thing I want to talk about in regards to it was the structure and the writing. Like, this was the very first thing that I observed as I was reading. I think it was my very first note. I wrote something like, what incredible structure. the fact that we start with like the inciting incident from the very first part of the timeline in the 50s with Georgie, and then the inciting incident from the second part of the timeline with the horrible attack on Adrian, that is such setup for both of these timelines. And then we move on to the 6 phone calls. Now, the 6 phone calls is actually one of my favorite parts of the novel, I would say. I thought it was so genius, the way that we had like over 100 pages just on character work for these main characters. Every single one of them I wanted to know more about. I wanted to stay with them. It was funny to me because when each chapter ended and I was pulled in a new direction, I normally would be annoyed by that because I'm like, I want to stay here, like I care about this. But within 3 sentences, I was like, okay, no, I'm on board. And I also really liked that each one was so interesting. So like, it wasn't just, it's all the protagonists and we talk through each of the protagonists from their perspective, from their point of view. We had some were from the perspective of the protagonist, some were from their spouse. Ben's was from the bartender, which I loved that chapter. And then Beverly's kind of switched between her and Tom, which that in itself blew me away, but I'm gonna talk about that a bit more later. So it was always interesting. Like, I feel like King is just a minefield of ideas. There is so much diversity in the way that he writes, in the structure and in the creativity, that you just never get bored. I definitely will say that it was a little bit disorienting at times as a first reader. And why I'm not too annoyed by this is because I feel like on a reread, I'm going to love it. For me, as a first-time reader, moving from the kids to the adults, to back to the kids, it got a little bit frustrating at times because I just wanted to know what was going on, and I felt like we had to wait so long for some payoffs. It's not a negative from me. Like, this is just me being impatient. I don't think it's a negative on King's writing because everything he wrote was engaging. Keeping in line with the structure, do you know, one thing that I noticed that I kind of found funny was when I was starting to get to my peak annoyance about not being able to stick with some things, it felt like King knew this, and he knew that his reader was going to get a little bit annoyed with not having some payoff. So what he would do was like add little sections at the beginning of chapters from the other timeline, and that really helped to like satiate my thirst, because even though I had to wait a while to get like the full on next timeline, I still got little bite-sized pieces here and there. Again, I just cannot praise his structuring enough. I thought it was brilliant. A couple of things that I definitely have heard about King is that sometimes his work is just too long and there is just too much detail. And I definitely get that, because it is very true that King will start with one point, talk about 10 other things, and then finish the point. And I think if you're not really paying attention, it can be hard to follow. And I found that while I was reading. Like, sometimes I'm like, wait, what are we talking about? Because I've just kind of had to, in my mind, remember 5 different characters and 3 different events, and I'm still not sure what the point of this whole thing was. So I really had to like make sure I was in it. But because of that, it felt like it was really engaging me. Like, I really was sucked in and I was so there while I was reading it. I personally didn't mind that. It really worked for me. All of the extra depth and extra information and world building and side characters having so much depth, I loved. I can see why it might irritate some people, but it just didn't irritate me. Tell me more about Derry and all of the random events that happen, and tell me more about all of these little side characters that we probably shouldn't care about, but I just do. Now, the one thing that did bother me in terms of structure and writing was the stuff with the, what was it called? The 3 visitors? Yeah, the 3 visitors is what I've got written down, so I'm hoping that's right. So I loved these chapters. I think it was a really well-needed break, and it reminded us of some of the other characters that I kind of was interested in. Now, Tom, I probably could have done without. I didn't need to be inside his head again, and I didn't need that scene, but, I think, like I say, it was interesting to have these 3 new characters. It kind of reminded me again of the phone calls, because it was like moving around and just constantly keeping my brain entertained. But hearing more about Henry and where he ended up, and how like it had infiltrated his mind and was still infiltrating his mind, and Audra as well, because I really liked Audra. I thought she was a great character. I loved these chapters. And what bothered me was it took so long to hear from them again, and each one of them set up such a like, oh my god, what's going to happen? Like, it was really thrilling. Like, Henry had escaped and was coming after them, and it was like, oh my god, that's really intense. And then Audra was following, and we knew that was a terrible idea because like all these horrible things was happening and she had no idea what she was walking into. Like, that was really intense. And same with Tom. Like, I was so scared for Beverly, and I just, oh god, it was just crazy. So all of those things, like my anxiety was so high, and I was like, I need to know what happens. And then it was so long before we got anything that by the time we did, I didn't care as much. And then the payoff just really wasn't there. I think Henry was maybe the best because we did have like quite interesting dynamics between him and the characters that he encountered. But again, it felt kind of like it was just thrown in there as a plot device. And the same with Audra and with Tom. Like, Tom, for starters, just, there was no point of him being there. I mean, I guess the one thing I liked about it was how it kind of paralleled him and Henry. That was really fascinating to me, and it kind of made me think that this entity just knew the right people to pick. So that was fascinating to me. But I just wish that we would have heard more about them. It felt like there was no need for them to be there. And I wished there was, because there was such great setup. Anyway, I've talked about this too long. I'm going to move on. The next thing that I really want to talk about is trauma, and particularly childhood trauma, because I felt like it was such a major part of this story. I felt like the narrative had a lot of empathy. There was so much room to understand and see the trauma and not shy away from it. And it also was presented in a nuanced way where it wasn't kind of shoved in your face, this is how you should feel, this is how it affects the characters. It allowed you to really see them. It made me cry many times. There were a few scenes, like when I think about them, one of them I'm going to talk about soon was Beverly's phone call, but also Eddie's moment in the hospital. That was really powerful as well. The scene with Richie and Bill when they're talking about George and his death and the guilt. There were just so many raw and really real and relatable moments. I feel like King used this narrative to show how our childhood trauma doesn't define who we are, but it does shape who we are. And it's really important to recognize that and to have compassion for that. That was my favorite part, I think, was the amount that we really got to see the beauty and the strength in these characters who had suffered a lot of trauma. It just was really powerful. So I'm going to talk a bit about Beverly's phone call now. This was the moment, I think, for me when I just was blown away, like the first one anyway. I have many thoughts about Beverly as a character, how she was formulated, and not all of them are positive, but in this particular scene, I was very impressed. The fact that it went from being inside Tom's head, which was so difficult to read. It was very hard to be inside the head of somebody who was so openly aware of his behavior and reveled in it. And then the fact that it shifts and we move into Beverly, it felt so much like a call to her power. She's taking control of this narrative. It gave her a lot of power, a lot of strength. The scene itself was just so visceral as well that I struggled through it, and I think that's why it made me so emotional at the end, because it was like I'd gone through that journey and I was watching a close female friend or a sister have this moment where she just, enough's enough. One of the things as well that I loved so much was that she got this phone call and it reminded her of her childhood, and what she did was pack clothes that were innocent. They were ones that made her feel childlike. I can't remember exactly what it was, if it was ones from her childhood or if it was just really plain, innocent type of clothing. I know that sounds kind of weird, but like if I compare it to the fact that she removes the lacy nightgown that's covered in blood and puts on a blouse and like more covered clothing, it felt like in that moment she was, rejecting this idea of her needing to be sexual, and she was choosing to take care of that inner child part of her. And then when it reached the end, and I'm going to read out this passage because this was the passage for me that just made me cry so much. And it says, She was 3 blocks away, walking with no clear sense of where she was going, when she realised her feet were still bare. The one she had cut, the left, throbbed dully. She had to get something on her feet, and it was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. Her wallet and credit cards were at home. She felt in the pockets of her jeans and came up with nothing but a few puffs of lint. She didn't have a dime, not so much as a red penny. She looked around at the residential neighbourhood she was in. Nice homes, manicured lawns and plantings, dark windows. And suddenly she began to laugh. Beverly Rogan sat on a low stone wall, her suitcase between her dirty feet, and laughed. The stars were out, and how bright they were. She tilted her head back and laughed at them, that wild exhilaration washing through her again like a tidal wave that lifted and carried and cleansed, a force so powerful that any conscious thought was lost. So it was this moment for me where it was like, it felt like true female power. In this moment, we see the contrast of how all the male characters, they've kind of just pushed everything to the side, and then when they're faced with the reality of the trauma again, they just fold under the pressure. They don't know how to handle it. Some get wasted, some have breakdowns. One even doesn't want to live anymore. And Beverly has this feeling of calm and clarity, and she makes this choice, and I found that really moving. It seemed like she was so strong, and the fact that in spite of everything, she's been injured, she has nothing, and she's laughing and looking at how beautiful the stars are. It was amazing for me. That felt like one of the realest depictions of trauma and overcoming trauma and moving through it, because it's not pretty. It's not a beautiful thing. It's not a simple thing. It's not one day you just wake up and it's better. It is messy and dark and hard. But in spite of that, you laugh and you see the beauty. And it just felt so incredibly well captured in that scene, and especially for a female character. And I do have a lot of things to say about the problems with the writing of the female characters in this book, especially Beverly, but in this particular moment, I just loved it. Yeah, I found her really inspirational. There's another brilliant quote. I'm gonna have to read it. It's the one that I think really, really defines trauma, and it's one of my favorites. So this comes from Eddie, and he has just been attacked, and he says, "I think it was the first real pain I ever felt in my life," he would tell the others. "It wasn't what I thought it would be at all. It didn't put an end to me as a person. I think it gave me a basis for comparison, finding out you could still exist inside the pain, in spite of the pain." I loved that sentiment. It felt like it was flowing throughout the entire novel. The next thing I want to talk about is the characters. So this was another thing that I felt like was just superb. I think that King really shines in his character work. Even the side characters, some of those were my favorites. I absolutely adored the bartender. It was his perspective in Ben's phone call section. I just really loved him. I fell in love with him in such a short space of time, and he wasn't even the focus of the chapter. Incredible. But there's so many great side characters. Kay as well. I really loved Kay. I wanted to know more about her. Her and Beverly's friendship is an interesting thing I would have liked to have known more about. First of all, I want to talk about the main 7 though. I just loved them all so much. It really did feel like they were kind of my childhood friends or my kids, or I don't know what the feeling is, but just such a fondness for all of them. They felt so real, and I love that we got to see them as children and then as adults. Just amazing. I'm going to talk about each of them one by one. So we'll start with Ben. I think Ben was my favourite. He was such a sweetheart, so kind and lovely. The thing I loved about him so much was just that he was so brave and true to himself. He was just good. He knew what the right thing to do was and what the wrong thing to do was, and he held on to that so much. It seemed like even though he was teased for being overweight and he was bullied and he didn't have any friends at the start, he held on to this idea in his heart of who he was, and that just never changed. He's just so brave as well. I loved him. I loved him so much. Okay, so let's talk about Bill next. Again, I think Bill was a really well-written character. My favorite element of Bill was kind of what wasn't said. And I think that we see that his need to be a leader and to be reckless, and even the way that he rides around on silver just so fast that everybody says it's way too big for him and it's way too dangerous. He clearly was struggling so much with Georgie's death and with his guilt and grief and feeling like it was his fault, and like his only way of coping with this, because he didn't have the support of his parents, he just wanted to run away from it, and he just didn't care about the consequences. I feel like that was his way of grieving, and that felt really true to life, especially from a child. So that was the most interesting thing for me about Bill's character. The other thing that I loved about him is that even though all of his dialogue, or most of his dialogue, is written with a stutter and speech impediment, it didn't feel like that was his character. Like, it felt like it was part of his character, but there was a lot more to him, which I really liked about him. And I loved that by the end, he had that moment in the final battle where he realized that it wasn't his fault, and that he didn't need anyone else's permission. So there's a couple of quotes that I like to read about this. One of them is the conversation with Richie that made me fall in love with Richie so much, to be honest. And the second is from near the end, where he is kind of coming full circle as an adult. This is when they are talking about Georgie's death and the picture, and Bill feels like it was really Georgie and he was trying to scare him. And Richie says, "I don't think so," he said. "If you stabbed him in the back or shot him, that would be different. Or even if you, gave him a loaded gun that belonged to your dad to play with, and he shot himself with it. But it wasn't a gun, it was just a boat. You didn't want to hurt him. In fact," Richie raised one finger and waggled it at Bill in a lawyerly way, "you just wanted the kid to have a little fun, right?" Bill thought back, thought desperately hard. What Richie had just said had made him feel better about George's death for the first time in months. Richie just comes at it from a way where he's not analysing and he's not taking things so seriously. He's just like, well, that's not true. That's not the case. He absolutely didn't want that. You just wanted him to have fun. You can't blame yourself. And he says it in such a way, and this is what I love about Richie, is he's just so matter of fact. He's like, why are you thinking so hard? It's nothing. You just wanted him to have fun. We all need somebody like that, don't we? Where we get all in our heads and caught up in things, and then you just need somebody to be like, stop it. That's ridiculous. For me, anyway, the point is that I just love this about Bill's character. It feels really true. And then the fact that at the end, and this is probably, I would say, my favourite quote in the entire novel. I'm sorry I'm reading so many quotes, but they're just so good. But this one is my favourite in the entire novel, and it really shows the process that Bill has gone through in this journey. And this is when they are battling it in the final battle. "Stand. Be brave, be true. Stand for your brother, your friends. Believe in all the things you have believed in. Believe that if you tell the policeman you're lost, he'll see that you get home safely, that there is a tooth fairy who lives in a huge enamel castle, and Santa Claus below the North Pole making toys with his trove of elves, and that Captain Midnight could be real. Yes, he could be, in spite of Calvin and Sissy Clark's big brother Carlton saying that was all a load of baby stuff. Believe that your mother and father will love you again, that courage is possible, and words will come smoothly every time. No more losers, no more cowering in a hole in the ground and calling it a clubhouse, no more crying in Georgie's room because you couldn't save him and didn't know. Believe in yourself." Bill's understanding that it wasn't his fault and that he can choose to forgive himself for something that has been playing on him for such a long time. And you see it that even when he couldn't remember anything, he was still writing it into his stories, and it just never went away. And I think that's such a full circle moment. That was the thing about Bill that really drew me to him. So that's why I wanted to talk about that with Bill. Now, one thing I will say about Bill, I didn't love him as much as the others as an adult, just because I don't know, I really liked Audra, and I thought that she didn't deserve any of what happened, and she didn't get any information that really made sense, and even when Bill was there and his behavior with Beverly, I just feel like it came out of nowhere and it just was inexcusable. I just didn't appreciate that at all. And then Bill just not being there for his wife, and then it coming back at the end that he does end up getting her back. I don't know. It felt a bit off for me. I didn't like it. I just didn't like it. So that just made me have a little bit of a problem with Bill, I would say. Okay, next, Beverly. So I've talked about Beverly already, and I think, like I say, I thought she was fantastic. I particularly enjoyed reading her because obviously she's the only female main character, so I'm glad that we had one. But there are so many things about it that I really hate. And I think it was because she was written so strongly through the male gaze, through King's male gaze, but also through the other characters' male gaze. I also struggled with how much she was sexualized as a kid and as an adult. I just didn't like how much attention was brought to the fact that she was a woman and she had a woman's body. But I really found her journey and her story very compelling. I'll leave it there for now because I'm going to have a few more thoughts on this in a later section. Let's move on to Richie. Loved Richie. I think he was a really needed, lighthearted break from all the intensity, and because it didn't seem to me that Richie kind of had any personal problems. Like, the others kind of had specific things they were dealing with, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like Richie was just kind of the voice of reason. His trauma came from all of the events that happened with it in that summer. And actually, now that I think about it, wasn't it he was the only one who hadn't seen it beforehand? So maybe that's an indication that, you know, the others were all dealing with demons and they were then vulnerable to its advances, and Richie kind of wasn't, because there wasn't something that he was dealing with. So I think that's really interesting. Kind of, yeah, very fascinating. I hadn't thought about that before, but I think that Richie just provided a necessary change of pace. I also loved the fact that it was him at the end who kind of saved the day. And I mean, it was him and Eddie who kind of saved the day, but you know, you think it's going to be Bill and then it's Richie. And I loved that it was laughter that was the defeat of it. I also really loved Richie's relationship with Beverly. I feel like, for me, it seemed like Richie was the only one who really thought of her as a person and not as a female. He would be the person that I would want as my friend out of everyone. It just felt like he treated her like the rest of them. And I really liked that. I really appreciate that. I had some big problems with some of Richie's voices, though. I will go into that later again. But that was one thing that I really struggled with because I liked Richie's character so much. And then there were these moments and the voices that he was using, and I just really hated it. So yeah, that was a problem for me. So next we have Eddie. Eddie really broke my heart. Probably the most out of all of them. Halfway through the novel, I was a little bit disappointed in the writing of Eddie. And I made a note of, like, I'm not attached to him, and I want to be, because it felt like his illness was kind of played up for laughs, or for like it just was glossed over. It felt to me like it was glossed over, the fact that he was suffering severe abuse, and I felt like I wasn't getting enough information about that. And that really bothered me and upset me. Like the scene where we hear about him putting his foot in the x-ray and his mother just absolutely losing it, like bringing all this attention to herself and absolutely traumatizing him and scaring him so much. Oh, it was just horrible. But what I will say is that I do feel like this was rectified later on, especially with the conversation with the doctor when he tells him and kind of shatters his reality of the fact that his medicine is just water. And again, the hospital scene as well, where he doesn't want his mother there, and the abuse that he faced was so insidious. His mother had been crafting this complete alternate reality and he just was stuck within it. So I really struggled with that. I really found it hard to read about it and not have it taken seriously, but I do feel like this was rectified later. I also like that they didn't just they had that moment when they talked about how if this were a movie, I would find out this information and it would all go away and I would not be ill anymore. And the fact that they addressed this, and that even as an adult, he was still using his inhaler, and he had married a woman similar to his mother, you know, similar to Beverly, and marrying someone similar to his father. I think those two have a lot of parallels as well, because that's true. Like, you don't just get over abuse. I think that it was important that we could see Eddie and we could sympathize with him and understand him. He wasn't forced to just get better. Okay, so let's talk about the final two, and that is Mike and Stan. And these are the two that I had the biggest issues with, I would say. Now, I just feel like they weren't given as much depth. The other ones like wormed their way into my heart. And even though these two did as well, I don't feel like they were given as much. And, let's start with Stan because, we don't see Stan as an adult. And so I get that not as much emphasis was put on him and on his character. I think we only had like one thing from his perspective, but I just think, imagine how great it would have been if we completely fell in love with him in the 50s chapters and like knowing that he was dead. I think that would have been really difficult and really impactful, like just as a narrative technique. So I'm kind of sad about that. I wish that I'd have known more about him because he was one of the members and it felt like it was kind of just like, well, he's one of the 7 and he was important, but it's just a throwaway. So I wish I'd have had more from Stan. And then Mike, I really loved Mike. And I think the problem that I had was that I don't feel like he was given enough room. It seemed for me personally that he was just there to narrate others' stories. And this really bothered me, like him being the only black character and being there to fulfill the stories of others just really irritated me. I get that he is kind of a researcher and like looks into archives and things like that. So, and he was the one who stayed behind and held everything together and remembered things. So he's kind of the one that is facilitating the events and noting down the events and kind of explaining it to the reader. And I get that he was used for that purpose, but in doing so, it felt like he was just a facilitator, and that bothered me. I think that there was a lot to his story, and I just wish that King had spent a bit more time on who Mike was and not just what he was providing to the narrative. I just wanted more from him. Not more from him, more for him, I think. I felt like out of all of them, apart from Stan, Mike was the one who was given the least. He wasn't even involved in the final battle. Like this really irritates me. Because it wasn't even like he was the one to stop Henry and make sure they could all go through with it. Like he was just ambushed and then was kept away from everything. I did love his father though, and I loved the relationship he had with his father. I really enjoyed the fact that we got to learn all these things about Derry, so I'm glad that we had a character that did explain all of the things. I wish that we'd have been able to have a bit more about him as a character. Okay, keeping in line with the characters now, I want to talk a bit more about the villains, because God, there were some absolutely awful, amazing villains. The fact that there were so many villains in this one book that I viscerally hated, like with such vitriol, was great. I mean, it's sometimes hard, sometimes difficult, but yeah, God, does King know how to write a villain? It just felt like there was such strong examples of humanity's evil, like psychopaths and sociopaths and abusers and bigots and just hateful people, and it was difficult because a lot of them were so rooted in reality. But yeah, like Tom, awful, and Beverly's father, of course, just I hated them. I absolutely hated Eddie's mum as well. I think that she was absolutely awful. The fact that she is the adult and is making everything about herself and doesn't have the ability to be there for Eddie, or like she just, I hated it. These three characters, especially Tom, Beverly's father, and Eddie's mum, abusers through and through. Just the control and the selfishness and the insidiousness. I hated them. I thought King did a great job writing them. Then we have like Henry and his father, and Patrick Hockstetter as well. Maybe I'll put in this category of just dark hearts, dark souls. They just were really great foils to the other characters, and I think sometimes honestly too much. Like I struggled reading about them because they were so evil. I thought they were written so well, great character work. Anytime I was in their head, I just wanted to get out of there. It was just too much almost. Yeah, but I thought that King did a great job with his villains. I also hated Beverly's mum as well, because, you know, the fact that she was aware, I think she was aware of what was happening, of who her father was, and I don't just mean what was happening when she was around, but what she suspected to be happening, and the fact that she did nothing. I really hated her as well. I think that King had a great way of showcasing just the worst of humanity. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is it itself, the horror element, the supernatural element of this entire series. And like I said at the beginning, my thought was that it was just a creepy clown. So when I first started reading, I struggled with the idea that it was a clown, because the way that the other characters was responding was like with such fear and terror about what had happened. And I think this is me being influenced by pop culture, but like I just couldn't get the thought of like just this silly, ridiculous clown out of my head. So it felt a little bit hard for me to link that with the complete impending doom. So I do think that's a bit of contextual bias. But what I loved about it was that it wasn't just the clown. And as we moved through, it was the way that they had different forms of it and how it represented itself as what you feared the most. And I also enjoyed the fact that we learned that it mainly goes after children, because children are, one, the most vulnerable, but two, the most likely to be afraid, like true fear. They will see something that an adult will rationalize or be like, no, that can't be real, and they will believe. The fears of children are just so much more intense. So then the idea of it being a clown made more sense. And also I think maybe at the time when King was writing, clowns were maybe more beloved. So nowadays clowns have become a thing of fear. Like most people don't think clowns are funny or nice or great. Most people think that clowns are scary. So I think obviously we have this book to thank for that. I'll talk a little bit about the final form as well, because I felt a bit similarly with the fact that, you know, we'd gone through this entire narrative and then by the end we reached the point that it was a spider type figure. Like it felt a bit underwhelming for me. I wish it was something a bit more broad, and I did appreciate the fact that the spider seems like just its physical form. So I enjoyed the fact that when Bill went inside of its mind and they kind of had this like connection there, that it was something so big that it couldn't be comprehended. And the same with the smoke hole chapter. I haven't even talked about that, but I loved the smoke hole chapter and finding out information about it. And yeah, also the fact that if an adult looked at it, they would die or go crazy, like with Audra and Tom. That was terrifying, like absolutely terrifying to me. It was the parts outside of, like the more psychological parts of it that I found truly horrifying. The idea of the clown, the idea of the spider, even some of the other forms like the mummy, the werewolf, it was icky, but it wasn't scary. And so I found it a little hard to not find that ridiculous. But what I will say is I loved the fact that it would manifest as somebody's fear. The fact that it was so ominous that it just pervaded the town, and all of these things would happen in the town that weren't recognized by people outside of it, and like the news didn't report on it and people just turned away from it because it was just accepted. And the way that it could invade the minds of humans that had kind of already a propensity to violence or like evil, and then just magnify it. The fact that it invaded every corner of the town and of the people in a way that brought chaos. It had become the town, and just this ominous vibe of this town just was so unsettling. That was what was terrifying to me, and that is the horror element that I just absolutely loved. I really enjoyed the final battle scene as well as the adults, the children and the adults. And I loved how Derry was just collapsing in on itself. I just really enjoyed the connection of the two, of it and of Derry, and how they just kind of became one thing. That was my favourite part about it. Okay, I'm going to move on. Now let's move on to the section about some of the things I had an issue with. Some of the problematic things I found, some of the things I didn't like in the novel. I've kind of alluded to some of these things before, but I definitely think that they need addressing. I don't know if it's because it's a product of its time or because of the way that King writes, but for me, reading it today, these are just the things that I think are absolutely a problem. The first one I would say is the kind of descriptions of overweight people. I think it was described in a way that was like grotesque, and I really found that off-putting. I feel like anybody as well that was presented as being overweight, like particularly thinking of Eddie's mother and his wife here, were seen as like really nagging presences and disgusting. Or people like Ben, who he had that conversation with his teacher, who even said, "You're disgusting," basically. And the fact was that Ben had to get really skinny to prove him wrong. I felt like he needed to lose the weight in order to not be disgusting and lazy. That just didn't sit well with me. Really didn't like that. The next thing was, I just hated this. The amount that imitation of Black voices and Black speech was mocked in this, especially by Richie, and the use of the N-word as well. It was so frequent. I really, really didn't like that, especially because it was written by a white author. I'm not saying that King was on the side of this, because he wasn't. Like, he went out of his way to portray it as a negative thing and to see like the racism and the racists as antagonists, and we had some protagonists who were Black as well. But I still just was not a fan of the use of this, and I just found it really unnecessary. Talking of the voices as well, like especially Richie's voices were often imitations of marginalized groups, like, you know, Black slaves, Irish, Mexican. It was not okay that he was using these voices as ways to gain success, as ways for humor. I really hated it. That I could have absolutely done without. Also want to talk about the over-sexualization of women and of children. Especially like young girls. There was this one scene for me where I think it was Ben in the library, and he noticed a teenage girl's nipples from within her shirt, and it was completely unnecessary. There was no need to bring attention to her breasts or her nipples, and this is a child and it's being observed by an adult. The amount the breasts were mentioned in general was just obscene. Women have breasts. It didn't need to be noticed. I can understand why women might be over-sexualized from the perspectives of like Beverly's husband or father, because we want to hate them and we want to understand that they are sexist and misogynistic and just gross. But it was coming from our main protagonists as well, like the characters that we're supposed to love. It just made me uncomfortable every time. There was another scene as well that I really hated, where Beverly is crying and having this realization that she had been repeating patterns and had married her father and was just having a really vulnerable moment. And it's literally described that Bill gets excited in his pants. It felt very much like a male's understanding of what sex is, and how, isn't it just this great way of connecting? When a woman is being vulnerable and having a moment, the fact that was taken away and she was then objectified and it was brought into a sexual place, and then the fact that they literally leave this scene and have sex, I just hated it. That just is not how women work. Also, the homophobia, the violence, like the sheer violence of the first scene. I felt like, again, during this, it's Don, isn't it? Don Hegarty, the partner of Adrian, who is murdered, and there was just focus being on his like flamboyance, or like the fact that he was wearing makeup when he just witnessed an absolutely brutal, traumatizing, horrific event. I just really didn't like that focus was drawn onto that. Again, this is probably a product of the times, but I need to point it out because it was a problem for me, and this is my video. Okay. I also hated the vivid descriptions of animal abuse and murder. I think it just was not necessary. Like, I get the importance of explaining who Patrick was and the fact that he was killing animals, but having to read about the puppy in the refrigerator graphically over an extended period of time, I just was really uncomfortable with that. It really just did not work for me. I didn't need to know all of that information. It felt gratuitous. A lot of things at times felt gratuitous and like too voyeuristic for me. The final thing that I want to talk about is probably the big one, and that is the scene in the sewer with the 7 main characters. What I will say is I was infuriated by this scene. This is the biggest problem in this novel. I'm of course referring to the fact that there is sexual intercourse between Beverly and the other 6 protagonists. This is a way of them escaping when they're lost down in the cellars after the big battle so that they can come back out into the world. I need to point out the fact that these are children. It was a long scene. I hated that they were sexualized. I think it was completely unnecessary. I think from what I'm picking up, the point was to show them transitioning away from childhood, and that's the only way they could escape was by forgetting and by leaving it behind. But there were a million other ways I feel like this could have been showcased. It did not need to result in the sexualization of children. I just added nothing to the plot. I really, really wish it was not there. I also hated that it was told from Beverly's point of view, because again, it felt like a male understanding of how women are involved with sex. It came across like Beverly was trying to form this big bond with all her male friends. Women do not have to give sexual gratification to men to form connections with them. And it actually infuriates me that this was implied. The fact that this was a girl as well who was under constant threat of sexual abuse, and then we just have her be completely sexualized here, like, genuinely makes me sick. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. Delete the entire scene. Yeah, I'm not going to focus too much on this, but I do want to address it because I absolutely do not think it was necessary. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about is just, I'm still really lost by this idea of the turtle. Like, I don't know if this is just me and I'm just being stupid, but I genuinely don't know what it means. I know that we had it, which was kind of like the ominous force, and then we had this other force that was felt kind of like a fate or God, and that was guiding the children and maybe the good, and helping them along the way, helping them come together and have the ability to defeat it. But then we had the turtle, and it was mentioned a few times, and I really am lost. I'm so lost. If somebody can give me any explanation as to what they think the turtle represents, because I know that I think I know that the turtle is represented in other King novels, so if it's a spoiler, don't tell me, but just from within the context of this novel, I should know what that means. Okay, this has been very long. I really hope that it's okay and you don't mind me absolutely rambling on. I just had so many thoughts. But final observations. I was absolutely crushed by Eddie's death. I loved him. I was really sad to see him go. The ending as well. It made me really sad that they all just kind of went their separate ways again and forgot each other. I kind of interpreted that happening the first time because they weren't ready to face the trauma yet. And so the fact that this happened again is this saying that they still haven't faced it. I don't know, maybe it's a way of saying that now it's time to move on, which I like kind of leaving certain things behind, but it just made me sad that why do they have to leave each other behind? So let's wrap this up. This is my ending thoughts. I'm gonna get out of spoiler territory again. I loved so much about this novel. There were problems that I had with it, but overall, I just fell in love with King's writing. There were so many characters that I just absolutely adored. I'm going to give it a 4.5 out of 5. I went back and forth on this for a while. I was not sure whether to give it a 4 or a 4.5 because some of the elements that I didn't like, it was a big problem for me. But when I think about the narrative as a whole, the writing style, the characters, the plot, I was so blown away. I loved it. I want to read more of his works. So I'm going to give it a 4.5. I think it was brilliant. I'm going to leave it there. I Hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know if you want to see more King novels. Please let me know your favourites. I do not know where to start. There are so many. If you have any particular recommendations for me that you think I would like, or that you like and why you like them, please let me know, because I'd love to do some more King novels and yeah, get to that tier list eventually. And I've got lots and lots of plans for content coming up. I'm looking at doing quite a few different things on here actually. Maybe some classics, some book talk books that I've never read. I also have a series planned called Books versus Binge, where I'm going to read the book first and then binge the show or movie. So I think I'm going to try and do that with it, because I've never watched either the series, I think it's a 2-episode series, right? And then the 2 movies. I've never watched any of those. So I think I'm going to be watching those. If you would like to see that, let me know. I will record my first reaction to those. And another one I have on the horizon is the Shadow and Bone series, which I have not read and have not watched. So that might be coming up on our Books versus Binge series. Lots of things planned. So if you want to hang out with me some more, please subscribe and let me know what you'd like to see. Have an amazing rest of your day, everyone.